Observation L has to do with salary ranges and determining market value, reasonable salaries was not part of this. That would involve a compensation study. It was not part of the scope of our engagement. There were 10 CLI and 3 LifeDash employees that received compensation in excess of $60,000 annually. I don't think it's unusual for an IT company to have salaries in that range. One employee was promoted to the supervisory role and received a raise of 28% between 2012 and 2013.
Next observation is N, Continuum Labs related party contract with LifeDash for licensing. This is the line item in the expense draw request that relates to licensing. During the CLI contract, the expense line item for licensing was based on the contract between LifeDash and CLI. The contract was for end-user software license agreement and service agreement. The detailed listing of services rendered was provided as support for testing. This contract was executed by Travis Bond on both sides as owner of LifeDash and CLI.
Was there any information in there? I mean, the contract, he did it between himself, Travis to Travis.
Correct. It was executed on both sides.
Okay. So there was a certain amount of money tied to this?
Yes, $130,212.
Okay. Was there any information in there that anybody, staff or anybody on this board agreed to that and that amount and all that? I mean, or is it just something they did, turned in, and we give them the money?
It's been on the draw request schedule as
I understand that,
licensing fee.
but I didn't know it was between him and him. I mean, I'm just asking.
I don't know what you were privy to or what
I
you
mean,
were privy to.
so nobody here looked into that, probably.
I think it was, it was on our draw schedules that, and I think it was discussed in numerous meetings, that a large part of this project was that this LifeDash platform was already built, it was already, in existence, and they were building this application to work with that interface, I guess.
So you're saying that's a reasonable cost then?
I'm not saying that's a reasonable cost, because I don't have the expertise to say that's a reasonable cost, and I think they're saying they also don't have the expertise to
Well,
determine.
we actually questioned that cost, and we'll get to that and there's discussion, and I'm sure Mr. Bond will present his view on that, and I can see merit to both sides, but the reason, well, we'll get to that question cost in a minute.
A question though for you on the related party portion of this. My understanding is this agreement was in existence when Travis was not a related party, when it was LifeSync Technologies, and the agreement was executed under LifeSync Technologies. The $615,000 was paid during LifeSync Technologies. So then when the project transferred over, and he's in fact the CEO of both companies, one of the things I'm kind of trying to understand is how, could this have been done differently if he was in fact the authorized representative to sign for both companies?
Again, we listed this as an observation and not a finding, so we're not saying that we're questioning the cost because of that condition. There is a question cost related to the licensing, but it's for a different reason.
And on the LifeDash side, are you aware if there are any other owners, or is it a wholly owned company owned wholly by Travis Bond?
You can ask Mr. Bond, but I believe there were other owners of LifeDash.
The next observation is in Continuum Labs related party contract with Bond Medical Group, and this was the line item for equipment purchases, maintenance, and support. During the CLI contract, the expense line item for equipment purchases, maintenance, support was based on a contract between Bond Medical Group and Continuum Labs. The contract was for hardware support. A detailed listing of hardware and software, as well as services rendered, was provided as support for testing. According to CLI, this contract had been in existence since March of 2011 with LST that carried forward to CLI. And again, Mr. Bond is the owner of Bond Medical Group.
Were you able to determine, or is it addressed as to whether or not the costs provided or listed that you were, given were appropriate costs, or there were invoices to support?
This was not a question cost line item. The last observation is observation O. And again, a related party contract with Bond Medical Group. This item related to rent and data equipment. During the CLI contract, the expense line item for rent, data equipment, lease expense was based on a contract between Bond Medical Group and Continuum Labs. Travis Bond is the owner of Bond Medical Group. The contract was for leased hardware. The amount consists of subleases to 7 external companies during the life of the contract. The original leases were executed by Bond Medical Group due to requirements from the external companies. CLI asserted that each lease was used only for the project. Individual leases were provided as support for testing. And similar to the last one, this did not result in a question cost.
Now we go into the findings. Those were our observations, and again, that was to put our engagement in this project in context. Those didn't necessarily result in a question cost. The ones going forward, the findings did result in question cost. The first one relates to the LSD closeout. And I'm sorry to bore you, but I'm just going to read it so nothing gets lost in the translation. The LSD contract was entered into on October 11, 2011, and terminated upon performance of both parties according to the terms of the contract. CLI entered into an asset purchase agreement of LSD assets effective September 10, 2012. The agreement did not assume the cash balance of LSD at September 10, 2012. The assignment and modification agreement between CLI and IDA was effective on October 9, 2012, but signed on November 20, 2012. LSD provided a cash basis QuickBooks report closeout document to the IDA dated October 18, 2011 through October 5, 2012. LSD had a remaining cash balance of $58,280 on that date. The funds remained in the LSD bank account, and according to the bank statements, the balance was spent through November 2012. CLI provided a reconciliation of those funds with actual expenses incurred. Those expenses were largely payroll-related expenses. Since the asset purchase agreement dated and effective on September 10, 2012, and the assignment and modification agreement effective October 9, 2012, and because a $355,642 advance was paid to cover operating expenses for the period of September 10, 2012, and the end of October 2012, it is unclear how the expenses incurred by LST subsequent to September 10, 2012 related to the furtherance of this project. It is also unclear as to whether the expenses incurred by CLI during the period September 10, 2012 to October 9 should be reimbursable by the IDA. Based on the closeout report that was provided by LST, there was a $58,280 excess receipts over expenses on October 5, 2012. Based on the reviewed bank statement on October 5, 2012. There was $58,065 in daily cash balance. In addition, there appears to be other activity in the LSD account subsequent to October 5, 2012. However, reconciling this difference was not within the scope of our engagement. Therefore, since the cutoff of the contract dates were not clearly evident, we are questioning the remaining balance of the closeout on the closeout report dated October 5, 2012, $58,280, and recommend that IDA management follow up on any remaining differences. The management's response was pursuant to Section 14.0, the original contract between LSD and IDA provided that no part of this agreement shall be assigned, contracted, or delegated by either party to a third party without prior written consent of the other party. The asset purchase agreement executed between LSD and CLI could only become valid and binding on IDA's written approval. Until IDA approved the assumption in writing, which did not occur until November 20th, 2012, LSD was still obligated to perform under the original contract. During this time, LifeSync continued to perform under the original contract, working in conjunction with CLI, and the remaining balance in question was used to maintain LSD operations on the project. Specifically, LSD continued to work on the Blue Water development roadmap and functionality, coordinated with CLI on prospective transition of Blue Water application to CareSync, continued coordination with CLI on the development of multiple applications related to the Tech River project, continued market research and memorandum drafting, continued analysis on the market effects of regulatory changes, continued creation and coordination on the development of marketing materials, and continued cultivating a sales pipeline. Additionally, in section 3.1 of the assumption and modification agreement, LSD warranted that it had maintained its eligibility for the IDA grant award. Such a warranty was only possible because LSD maintained its eligibility and capability of performing under the original IDA contract and continued its operation throughout this process.
I did have a question on this finding because I'm a little bit confused by the wording in the finding. You know, as I started reading, I initially understood that there was a balance of the $58,000 that you referenced earlier that was remained in the LifeSync accounts, which, you know, according to the asset purchase agreement, I'm assuming the issue is that should have been transferred to Continuum. Is that?
According to the agreement, cash was not one of the assets that was to be transferred over.
Okay. But then in the next paragraph, no, I'm sorry, at the end of the first paragraph, you also stated that CLI provided a reconciliation of those funds with actual expenses incurred. Those expenses were largely payroll-related expenses. So you were able to verify that those dollars were spent on payroll?
We did not test that supporting documentation. We were provided a listing of the expenditures after that time period, and it actually showed that more money was spent than the $58,000 by LSD.
So you didn't necessarily test those documents to the same standards as the other documents, but you were provided with documentation that the funds were spent on the project?
We were provided with,
An Excel schedule.
An Excel schedule that showed what the expenditures were.
So not like payroll, not the payroll records or the supporting documents?
Right. The gist of the finding has to do with really uncertainty about the timing of when things should have cut off. When one contract should have cut off and when the other one should have started.
So it's not necessarily questioning whether or not the you state that you couldn't determine that $58,000 was spent on the project, but that is more semantics, that the payroll records were not requested because they weren't in the scope of work. I'm just trying to make sure I understand.
That wasn't in our scope of work. And what we're recommending is that management follow up on that and make sure that those were expenditures on the project.
Although we did not test it, we just obtained that Excel schedule. It did appear as though those were the same types of expenses that may have been requested for the draw request from CLI. So it did appear as though maybe that those costs, I don't believe that they were paid as duplicated, but they may have been requested as duplicated.
Yeah, I guess
Paid by the IDA, I'm sorry, so the IDA paid, but not that the individuals receiving that had been paid twice.
So this finding is more about a timing issue, not necessarily questionable cost, or that the money was not spent on the contract?
We probably need to back up and talk about what a question cost is. A question cost is, I know we talked about the definition, but question cost, it's not up to us to say it's a disallowed cost. There's a difference between a question cost and a disallowed cost. It's our job to find, during our testing, items that may not have proper support, or we question whether it's the business purpose. But it's up to management to investigate that and come up with what's called a management decision and decide whether to allow the cost or disallow the cost. So it's not our job to say this is a disallowed cost. This is just our job to say we're questioning these costs, and management needs to follow up further on these.
The $58,000 balance, though, is in question. We do state there that because of the dates of the contract are unclear, and when we looked at the closeout report, that even the date of the closeout that they had given us for the $58,000 was October 5th. And when you go back to the periods listed when the contract dates were signed, you either have October 9th, you have November 20th, or you have September 10th. So the fact that that report was printed on October 5th is in itself probably not an accurate dollar figure. It was also printed on the cash basis. And as many of you know, you may write a check or have incurred an expense, but on a cash basis, if that's what you show you have in the bank at that time, it may not reflect that cash or that check is not cleared. So there were several areas of ambiguity there. And again, as I had stated previously, when the Excel schedule was provided, the payroll that was on there related to Jamie and Jennifer, obviously, and those were also requested within the COI request reimbursement. I shouldn't say reimbursement because we figured out that those were advances, but during that period, they were requested under, and again, those were ones that we didn't test, so we just questioned the entire $58,000 for all of those reasons.
So there's a potential that we overpaid that amount, is that what you're saying?
There's a potential, yes.
There's a potential that we overpaid that amount.
There is that potential, and we're suggesting that management follow up. As CLI management's response asserts that $58,000 was expended on the project, and we're suggesting that we're questioning the 58, but suggesting that management follow up and make sure that was a legitimate expense on the project.
So if you were charged with I'm not suggesting that we're charging you with that follow-up, what would you be looking at or requesting in the payroll records?
That, and if there's any other documentation substantiating that they spent that time on the project.
And I would also be looking for the duplication between the two contracts.
Right, like Tricia said, there was payments made for marketing services to LST during that same period.
Is there a chance that this could have happened in other months that you didn't look at? Or is this a one-time thing?
The money ran out.
Oh, okay.
The 58,000.
Well, is this where I asked about the advance, the 355,000?
I believe that is the next one.
Oh.
And you get me for probably 10 minutes. So I will read it to you.
Tricia gets that one.
Okay, all right.
All right, we ready to move on? 2014-002. And again, we apologize, but really with the depth of what these comments are, the most effective thing to do is just to read it out loud. So this relates to the CLI contract bridge billings, which are termed as advances between LST and CLI. The initial billing of the CLI contract, which was selected for testing as sample October 2012 in the amount of $355,642, was paid out as an advance. Subsequent payments from the LST contract in the amounts of $58,557, please note that is a different $58,000 amount from the previous filing 2014-001. $58,557, $30,080, and $11,324 were also paid to CLI and considered advances during the October and November 2012 for expenses incurred from September 10th, 2012 through October 31st, 2012. In the January 2013 board packet, a draw request dated October 9th, 2012 in the amount of $354,999 $336 was submitted as a reconciliation for the advanced funds of the $355,642. During our testing, we were provided a corrected draw request reconciliation listing total expenses incurred of $410,892 for the period of September 10th, 2012 through October 31st, 2012. It is unclear as to whether expenses incurred by CLI during the period September 10th, 2012 through October 9th, 2012 should be reimbursable by the IDA, as we have not included those as question costs. And we reference finding 2014-001, and again, that's the dating of the contracts as to which date should have been allowed.
Tricia, would you repeat that, please?
The whole paragraph?
It was unclear part.
It is unclear as to whether expenses incurred by CLI during the period September 10th, 2012 through October 9th, 2012 should be reimbursable by the IDA, and we have not included those as question costs. Those may be additional question costs that you want to consider. And again, that's based off of the contract dates and the effective dates of the contract, because the IDA contract that was signed on November 20th, but effective October 9th.
Okay, let me see if I can reconstruct what actually happened. The agreement between LifeSync Technologies and Continuum Labs was consummated on September 10th, 2012. But
Asset purchase agreement.
the asset purchase agreement, whatever. The IDA, in an ensuing meeting in October, agreed to provide bridge funding to Continuum Labs to operate in the interim period, and it did so. And there was an ensuing assumption and modification agreement. Are you taking an interpretation that the assumption and modification agreement left that period of time void and does not address any expenses that occurred during that period of time?
We're saying the dates of the contract are unclear from what we could determine. The intent, I believe, for sure from Mr. Bond's side, is that he was eligible to start reporting expenses on September 10th, the date of the asset purchase agreement.
And I believe there was a meeting of the minds with this board that those expenses that he began incurring at that time were either going to be transferred from the remainder of the LifeSync contract, which did in fact occur.
There were three payments.
$58,200 in September, the $30,000 some odd dollars in October, and the residual of the April draw, $11,000 and some odd dollars. All of that money was authorized by this board to go to Continuum Labs in addition to the bridge funding request. Even though the actual assumption and modification agreement wasn't consummated or approved by this board until November and not signed until November 20th, to the November meeting. So you are taking a legal interpretation that there are voids or gaps, spaces in the contract that question the expenses in this period of time. I just need to understand.
We are taking more.
Normally what we see is expenses that are incurred outside the term of the contract. Haven't been, and this is coming from auditing of federal and state grants, so it may be different than this situation, but normally in the audit of a federal or state grant, if there's an expenditure that's outside the term of the contract, then it would be a question cost or potentially disallowed. And that's what we're saying here was, even though there was an assumption on Mr. Bond's part that as soon as we signed that contract with LST, he's taking over the project, that there was a gap in between that date and when the contract was approved by this board.
And also to note that both LST and CLI were in operation spending money during that time frame. CLI began reporting expenses to be reimbursed by the IDA on September 10th, and LST, with that remaining $58,000, spent funds through November.
So had there been language in the assumption and modification agreement to go back into the date of their asset agreement in September, you would have taken a different approach?
Yes.
We actually took the same approach as if it would have been backdated to September.
And
We
board
incorporated
minutes
expenses.
do not apply in this circumstance?
We incorporated the expenses through September tenth, as was what was verbalized as the intention and how Mr. Bond started reporting the expenses. So that's what we're stating here, is there may be more questionable costs if it is the pleasure of the board to determine that the October 9th date was more appropriate or the November 20th date was more appropriate. But what we used was the September 10th date, because that's what was asserted for the expense reimbursement of the advance.
The purpose of this paragraph is just to bring up the confusion between the dates, cutoff, startup, and, as it states in this last sentence, we're not questioning these costs, but we are saying that there was a lot of confusion at the beginning of the continuing contract as far as start date.
So contractually, we need to have some discussion as a board, go back, review the minutes, understand what the circumstances were at the time, and then either make provisions or modifications to address that in order for it not to be a finding. Is that what I'm understanding?
That's the first paragraph. And there's additional, more talk about the advances and how that was reconciled out. But for our purposes, the date that we began testing for CLI, the expenses began incurring on September 10th.
And if we had a deficit in the contract, it would be to make any payments that went to Continuum back to that same date. If you're gonna question the cost because the contract doesn't address the period of time between September 10th and October 9th or November, whatever, we need clarity in the contract.
It should be noted too that the first advance was received in October. I believe it was October 11, 15.
But in this instance, even though the contract date didn't happen, the board authorized and approved that funding. Both the advance and the payments of the remainder of the licensing money. The only money that's really been in question was the closeout money,
Right.
$58,500.
Correct.
And we do have a reconciliation of sorts of that at the end. We'll hold that.
All right, second paragraph. CLA tested the corrected draw request reconciliation, listing total expenses as $410,892. Again, to reiterate, that is dated from September 10th through October 31st during that period. And consider the following advances as applied to that period for expenses. The $355,642, $58,557, which came from the LST contract, $30,080, which came from the LST contract, and $11,324, also from the LST contract. The sum of the IDA payments was $455,603, and only $410,892 was listed as expenses in the corrected draw request reconciliation. Therefore, $44,711 remained as an advance where expenses had not been substantiated. The $44,711 was included as question costs. And then also the detail behind that is in the October 2012 testing, which is in the report.
Am I up?
I have a manager response. Do you want that first?
Yeah, I can wait.
Okay.
I probably forgot what I want to ask you about, didn't I?
Maybe you'll answer it. CLI, and this is again from Mr. Bond from Continuum Labs. CLI assumed that the LST agreement between the IDA and LST, whose consent and memorialization are outlined in the assignment and modification agreement executed between the IDA and CLI on November 20th, 2012. The assignment and modification agreement significantly increased the level of deliverables from the original LifeSync funding agreement. The transition process, along with the increased scope, required considerable effort and resources. CLI requested from the IDA board in advance during the process and accounted for how the funds were allocated using the template outlined in section 4.8 of the final agreement signed on November 20th, 2012. Amounts left on the LST agreement were received and were used on the deliverables outlined in section 4 of the assignment and modification agreement. During the Clifton Larson Allen testing, CLI provided an updated draw request reconciliation that accounted for the effective date of the asset purchase agreement between LST and CLI, September 10th, 2012. The reconciliation accounts for resources directed towards the deliverables of the projects that were in effect in September 2012. CLI performance included 10 Hardy County hires that started on November 5th, 2015. 15 days before, the IDA and CLI executed the formal agreement, as well as other activities associated with Tech River during the transition from September to November 2012. CLI operated in good faith with advances to perform prior to the execution of the formal agreement between the parties. And we do have one more finding that relates to advances.
The third finding, we talked about the end of the LST contract. We talked about the initial advance for the Continuum Labs contract. And as was stated earlier, what we found was there was an advance that was made in October. There were 2 payments made in December, and then what we saw in the January draw was based on actual expenses incurred during December. So this finding relates to that one period in between that doesn't seem to be accounted for. As referenced in the above finding, 2014-02 and observation 2014-C, we noted that we tested advances made for the months of September and October. Although not tested, we also noted that payments were made to CLI on December 5th, 2012 in the amount of $293,798, and December 11th from 2012 in the amount of $299,912. Also, as noted in observation 14C, we tested the January 2013 draw request that was based on actual expenses incurred in December 2012. Although not examined based on the above, it appears that one or both of the December payments were based on estimates and not actual expenses. Also, as noted in observation 2014C, the contract does not require actual expense to be incurred for the draw request to be paid. Therefore, we recommend a closeout report showing a full reconciliation of CLI's expenses incurred to payments made by the IDA for the period of September 10th, 2012 through January 31st, 2014. One other consideration is that even though the last IDA payment was made January 2014 in the amount of $59,043, the contract term was executed in the First Amendment to the assignment and modification agreement to June 30th, 2014. It is unclear as to whether any question costs or billing/advanced overages that may exist should be applied for expenses incurred during the remainder of the contract period, which ended June 30th, 2014. So basically what we're recommending here is there were 3 payments made October, November, December, and then there was a January draw that was based on December actual. What we're recommending is a comprehensive closeout report be filed with management showing total expenses incurred versus what the draw schedules paid out were. The CLI management response is payments dated on December 5th, 2012 and December 11th, 2012 was accounted for with November and December 2012 draw requests respectively. The agreement between IDA and CLI outlines the format to which draw requests can be made, and CLI made monthly requests accordingly as outlined in section 4.8 of the assignment and modification agreement between IDA and CLI. When possible, actual amounts were included, and others like overhead, taxes, employee benefits, and payroll related to expenses were estimated using industry standards as amounts included in categories listed per the format provided under section 4.8. Based on the June 30th, 2014, or based on June 30th, 2014, the contract end date from the First Amendment and Assignment and Modification Agreement. CLI has accounted for nearly $9.1 million in the project and acquisition costs related to this project. This is approximately $1.8 million in addition to of additional capital invested over amounts received from the IDA grant in the amount of $7,248,582. The almost $9.1 million on the project and acquisition cost does not include any cost incurred after June 30th, 2014. Since June 30th, 2014, CareSync has continued to invest in the project, which has included expanded operations and additional hires in Hardy County. As a result of the project's continued traction within the healthcare industry and the private sector capital raised after June 30th, 2014, CLI expects this trend of growth will continue in a way that continues to increase the project's positive impact on the Hardy County economy.